Ajamu Baraka, as many of you will know already, is national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace and was the 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket. Ajamu serves on the executive committee of the US Peace Council and the leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition, or UNAC. He is editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and contributing columnist in Counterpunch. He was recently awarded the US Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and the Serena Shim Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. We're very honored to have you, Ajamu. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika, and thank everyone who are involved in this very important conversation this morning. I'm not going to go through all of the specifics around the so-called defeat in Afghanistan of the US. I will say that in alignment with our first speaker, my assessment is in fact that the US did not in fact lose in Afghanistan, that it achieved most of its objectives. But the one element that it did not achieve was what I believe to be their main objective, which was to have a permanent presence, physical presence in the country as part of the efforts to not only destabilize Central Asia, but also to block the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative once that became clear that that was going to be a real threat to them. And even that decision was made a little late because it was quite clear from around 2007, looking at the internal conversations within the US, it was acknowledged that there was no military reality that could ensure the complete and total control of the country by the US, that for all intents and purposes, a definition of military success was in fact impossible. But yet the US remained, because of its greater global strategic objectives. But what I want to touch on is just very briefly the last few months of the Taliban drama in Afghanistan, but then more importantly, to talk quickly about what does all this mean for those of us who are opposed to global militarization, opposed to warmongering, opposed to imperialism. What might this mean for us? So very quickly, one of the things that struck us in the Black Alliance for Peace was the disarray among the rulers in the US around how to proceed with Afghanistan. There, of course, were hardcore elements that wanted to maintain some kind of presence inside the country. There were some other elements that were committed to what was, in fact, a redeployment of US assets from Afghanistan to complete the pivot to Asia. And it seems that within these various struggles that those elements that recognize that Afghanistan was now becoming a drain, that they had plundered as much as they could from the area, and that in fact, it was to their advantage to at least attempt to try to maintain some kind of Afghan government, but allow for the Taliban to be unleashed, if you will. That kind of destabilization, of course, always plays into the longer term strategic objectives of US imperialism. So, and when you look at the process of conversations between US authorities and the Taliban and the Afghan government just in the last 18 months, beginning with the communications that were taking place between then candidate Joe Biden with members of the Afghan government. We looked at communications beginning like in July 2019, where they were giving mixed messages to the Afghan government. They were suggesting that there would be an enduring relationship between the US and the Afghan government. And even after the Doha Agreement in February 2020, those assurances continued. When the now Democrat nominee Joe Biden was articulating efforts or articulating positions on Afghanistan, he indicated quite clearly that there was concerns with the Doha Agreement. There was signals that were suggesting that the Biden campaign was suggesting to the Afghan authorities that if he won the election, that the Doha Agreement would be seriously reevaluated. So there was efforts to give the impression that they were going to continue in Afghanistan. Once Biden, of course, won the election, there was a few months of complete and utter confusion, it appears, on the surface. But internally, it's quite obvious that that debate within foreign policy circles continued. And what was happening was that those elements that believed that it was more important to make the shift and to allow the Afghan government to attempt to try to survive, they had basically won out. For the first couple of months of the Biden administration, there was no firm commitment on the part of that administration to the Afghan government. And in fact, when you look at what was communicated as late as June, both in public and private, it's very obvious that the intelligence of the US understood that once the US withdrew from Afghanistan, that the Afghan government was in fact in trouble. And the most optimistic estimations was that it would collapse in 6 months. But that intelligence report that came out on June 23rd was countered by public statements that were made by General Austin and others on June 25th. And in conversations with the Afghan government, in which it was suggested that the Afghan government was in place and that it was going to survive. So, you know, these contradictions are important because in all of the conversations between the US and Afghan authorities, in any of these conversations was any mention of what might happen once the Afghan government fell, and all of the personnel that were in the country that had been working with the US for years. So what we have is basically a situation that is not so much as tragic as what we saw in Vietnam, but a situation that was developed as a consequence of the changing internal issues within the US government. It is inability to rule in the same way that sharpened those contradictions among the authorities in terms of how to try to maintain US hegemony, both in Central Asia and really globally. So the Afghanistan situation was lost. Everybody understood that. The question now becomes, what does it mean for us? In my last couple of minutes, let me just talk about that. That basically, it seems to us that there are some real possibilities for the anti-war movement, that there are implications ideologically for how we can proceed, that the US public, for example, and I will stay with the US public for a moment because that's my main theater of operation, has basically determined that these endless wars are no longer sustainable, that the cost both in lives and in resources are no longer being able to be supported. And that provides some real possibilities for us. On the other hand, though, we have some strong elements that are suggesting that there were mistakes in Afghanistan that can be corrected, that Afghanistan and other areas on the planet are areas of concern for the US, and with its continued sort of framing of the so-called war on terror as an entry point for intervention. And some of that messaging is beginning to resonate somewhat. But what we need to do as anti-imperialists, as folks who are pro-peace, is to impress upon the publics, both in the US and in Western Europe, that the planet can no longer sustain itself if there's still this continued commitment to global militarization and war. That the publics around the world are really committed to a new kind of dispensational power and a new kind of morality. We've got to push that. In the US, we want to raise up the issue of the military budget and what that means. We also want to suggest that we need to make peace a issue in the coming midterm elections. We want to raise the issue of and question the rationale for full spectrum dominance. We want to raise the issues of NATO and the US global military structures and bases. And we say we can begin to really aggressively support issues around or attempts to try to establish zones of peace in various regions. So we think that we have, that the US and European militarists are on the defensive. And it's really up to the anti-war community, the anti-imperialist communities, to sharpen its messaging, to ground itself in the social movements, and to raise these contradictions. We believe that we have the possibility of a real opening if, in fact, we are able to do that going forward. I end here. Thank you.